The old creaky house had stood on the edge of town for as long as anyone could remember. It was one of those places that kids dared each other to enter but never actually did. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving behind a weathered shell. The windows, dark and broken, looked like eyes staring out into the emptiness. Tom had always been curious about the house. He had heard all the stories growing up, the ones about strange noises and ghostly figures in the windows. But Tom was a skeptic. He didn't believe in ghosts or haunted houses. So one gray autumn afternoon, he decided to explore the house for himself. He stepped inside, the wooden floorboards groaning under his weight. The air was thick with dust, and cobwebs clung to the corners like ancient drapes. As he moved from room to room, he felt a chill in the air, but he brushed it off. It was just an old, abandoned house, after all. In what must have been the living room, Tom found a small door hidden behind a heavy curtain. It creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase leading down to a basement. His curiosity piqued, he descended the stairs. The basement was dark and damp, filled with old furniture covered in sheets. That's when he saw it, a small leather-bound book lying on an old wooden table. It was a diary. The name Emily was scrawled across the cover in faded ink. Tom opened the diary, the pages yellowed with age, and began to read. The first few entries were innocent enough. Emily wrote about her days, her friends, her family. But as he read on, the entries grew darker. Emily wrote about hearing strange noises at night, footsteps outside her bedroom door, whispers in the dark. She wrote about feeling watched, even when she was alone. Tom felt a shiver run down his spine, but he kept reading. The entries became more frantic. Emily described seeing a shadowy figure at the foot of her bed, waking up to find scratches on her arms. She wrote about her parents not believing her, thinking she was just having bad dreams. Then, one night, Emily wrote about deciding to find out what was haunting her. She stayed up late, hiding under her covers, waiting. Around midnight, she heard the footsteps again. She peeked out from under her blanket and saw the figure. Tall, dark, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he read. He could almost feel Emily's fear, her terror. She wrote about the figure getting closer, whispering her name. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last entry was short, just a few words scrawled in shaky handwriting. "It's here. I'm not alone." Tom closed the diary, his hands trembling. He felt a cold breeze brush past him and turned to see the basement door slowly closing. He was not alone. He could feel eyes on him, watching him. The air grew colder, and he could hear faint whispers. Panic set in. Tom ran up the stairs, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. He stumbled into the living room and froze. The shadowy figure from Emily's diary stood before him, eyes glowing in the dim light. It whispered his name, just like it had whispered Emily's. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He backed away slowly, his heart racing. The figure moved closer, its form shifting and changing. It reached out, and Tom felt a cold, clammy hand on his arm. He pulled away, bolting for the front door. He burst outside, gasping for breath. The sun had set, and the street was empty. Tom looked back at the house, half expecting to see the figure in the window. But there was nothing. Just the dark, empty windows staring back at him. He ran all the way home, not stopping until he was inside with the door locked behind him. He tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, that the diary had spooked him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had brought something back with him from that house. That night, Tom lay in bed, unable to sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the leaves outside made his heart race. He tried to ignore it, but then he heard it, a soft whisper, his name carried on the wind. He pulled the covers over his head, just like Emily had, and squeezed his eyes shut. The whispering grew louder, closer. Tom felt a cold presence in the room. He peeked out from under the covers and saw the shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It whispered his name again, and Tom felt a cold hand on his arm. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure leaned in closer, its breath icy against his skin. Tom felt himself being pulled into the darkness, the world around him fading away. The last thing he heard was the whisper, echoing in his mind, "You're not alone." The next morning, Tom's friends found his house empty. His bed was unmade, his phone and keys on the nightstand. But Tom was gone, vanished without a trace. The only clue was a small leather-bound diary lying open on his bed, the last entry scrawled in shaky handwriting. "It's here. I'm not alone." People in town still talk about Tom and the old house on the edge of town. Some say you can hear his voice at night, whispering from the shadows. Others say the house is cursed, that anyone who enters will never leave. But no one dares to go near it anymore. And if you ever find an old diary in a dusty, abandoned house, remember this story. Some things are better left alone. Because you never know what might be waiting in the dark, just out of sight, watching, whispering your name.
I never thought I'd end up here. My name's Emily, and I'm 16 years old. A few months ago, I got a babysitting gig for the Morrows. They were a wealthy family living in this big, old mansion on the edge of town. Mrs. Morrow was a tall, elegant woman, always dressed in expensive clothes. Mr. Morrow was quieter, but he had this intense look in his eyes that made me uncomfortable. The first time I went there, I was in awe of the place. High ceilings, fancy furniture, and this grand staircase that looked like something out of a movie. The Morrows had one little girl, Lily. She was about 6 years old, with blonde curls and a shy smile. The first few nights were fine. I'd put Lily to bed, and then spend the rest of the evening watching TV or doing homework. But after a week, things started to get weird. One night, I was sitting in the living room when I heard this strange noise. It sounded like scratching, coming from somewhere above me. I thought it was just an animal or something, but it kept going, and it started to freak me out. I decided to check on Lily. She was fast asleep, so I went back downstairs. The scratching continued. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard a faint whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent chills down my spine. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't just abandon Lily. I told myself it was just my imagination and forced myself to stay. The next night, it got worse. After putting Lily to bed, I heard the same scratching and whispering, but this time, there were footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was walking around upstairs. I went up to check, but all the rooms were empty. The only place I hadn't checked was the attic. I didn't even know the house had an attic until I saw the door at the end of the hall. The door was locked. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. A few nights later, I heard crying. It was faint, but it was definitely coming from the attic. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and started searching the house for a key. It took me a while, but I finally found one in Mr. Morrow's study. I made my way to the attic door, my heart pounding. The key fit, and the door creaked open. The smell hit me first, musty and stale, like the place hadn't been opened in years. I shone my flashlight around and saw boxes and old furniture covered in dust. Then I saw her. A girl, about my age, chained to the wall in the corner. She looked dirty and scared, her clothes torn. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Help me," she whispered. I rushed over to her. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "My name is Sarah," she said, her voice shaking. "I used to babysit for the Morrows too. They locked me up here after I found out their secret." I didn't have time to ask what she meant because, at that moment, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Heavy, determined footsteps. The attic door slammed shut, and I knew we were trapped. Mr. Morrow appeared at the top of the stairs, his face twisted in anger. "I told you to stay out of here," he growled. I backed away, pulling Sarah with me. "What are you doing? Why is she up here?" Mrs. Morrow appeared behind him, holding a long, thin knife. "You should have minded your own business, Emily." I tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Mr. Morrow grabbed me, and I struggled, but he was too strong. He threw me to the floor, and Mrs. Morrow stood over me, the knife glinting in the dim light. "You should have left well enough alone," she said, her voice cold. The last thing I remember was the knife coming down towards me. Then everything went black. I woke up later, my head pounding, in the attic. Sarah was beside me, crying. I felt a sharp pain in my arm and looked down to see a deep cut, crudely bandaged. The door was locked, and there was no way out. We tried to escape, but the windows were barred, and the door was solid wood. Days turned into weeks. They brought us food and water, but we were trapped. I don't know how long we were there, but it felt like forever. One night, Sarah and I were talking, trying to keep each other sane. She told me about the Morrow's secret. They were into some kind of dark stuff, rituals and sacrifices. She had found their hidden room in the basement, filled with strange symbols and old books. That's when they locked her up. I realized I had to warn people, tell someone what was happening. I found an old notebook and a pencil among the junk in the attic and started writing everything down. Maybe, somehow, someone would find it. As I write this, I can hear them coming up the stairs. I don't know what they'll do to us, but I have to try and get this out there. If you find this, please, don't come to this house. Don't take the babysitting job. The Morrows are not what they seem. I hear the key turning in the lock now. I don't know what's going to happen, but I need to hide this before they find it. If you're reading this, please, get help. Save us. The door creaks open, and I know our time is up. I can hear Mr. Morrow's footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming closer. And I know, in my heart, that we won't be leaving this attic alive. But if my story gets out, maybe someone else will. Maybe someone will stop them. I have to believe that.
It all started when John and Sarah decided to buy an old house in a quiet town. They were looking for a change, a fresh start, away from the city's hustle and bustle. The house was a century old, with creaky floors, tall ceilings, and a history that made it stand out. It had character, they thought. It felt like home. One rainy evening, a few weeks after moving in, they decided to explore the attic. The previous owner had left some old furniture and boxes, and they were curious. The attic was dusty and dimly lit, with cobwebs hanging from the rafters. As they were rummaging through the boxes, Sarah noticed something odd. There was a large, heavy bookshelf against the far wall, but it didn't seem to belong there. It looked too new compared to the rest of the attic.
John, help me move this.
Together, they heaved and pushed until it finally slid aside, revealing a small door behind it. The door was old and wooden, with a rusty handle. It was clear no one had opened it in years.
Should we?
Why not?
The door creaked open slowly, revealing a hidden room. The air inside was stale and thick with dust. They stepped inside, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The room was small, with wooden walls and a low ceiling. It looked like a child's playroom, untouched for decades. There were old toys scattered around, dolls with cracked faces and stuffed animals with missing eyes. But what caught their attention were the drawings. Dozens of children's drawings covered the walls, drawn with crayons and colored pencils. At first, they seemed innocent enough. Houses, trees, and smiling stick figures. But as they looked closer, the drawings became darker, more disturbing. One drawing showed a figure standing over a bed with a knife. Another depicted a child trapped in a burning house. Each picture seemed more twisted than the last.
This is creepy,
John said, his voice trembling slightly. Sarah nodded, unable to take her eyes off the drawings. They felt wrong, like they were looking at something they weren't supposed to see. They decided to leave the room and close the door, but the images haunted them. That night, Sarah had nightmares of the drawings coming to life. She saw the figure with the knife standing at the foot of their bed, the child screaming in the burning house. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding.
John, I can't stop thinking about those drawings.
She whispered, shaking him awake.
Me neither. There's something not right about that room.
Over the next few days, strange things started happening. They would hear whispers at night, soft voices they couldn't quite make out. Objects moved on their own, doors creaked open, and the air grew colder. One evening, Sarah was in the kitchen when she heard a loud crash from the living room. She ran in to find a vase shattered on the floor, even though it had been on a shelf out of reach.
John, this is getting out of hand. We need to do something.
We need to go back to that room. Maybe there's something we missed.
Reluctantly, they returned to the hidden room. This time, they brought a camera, hoping to document what they found. As they entered, the air felt heavier, like a weight pressing down on them. The drawings on the walls seemed to watch them, the eyes of the stick figures following their every move. Sarah picked up one of the old toys, a stuffed bear with a missing eye. As she did, she noticed something sticking out from under a pile of toys in the corner. It was a diary, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully and began to read. The diary belonged to a little girl named Mary, who had lived in the house with her family many years ago. Her entries started off normal, talking about school and friends, but soon they became darker. She wrote about seeing strange figures at night, hearing whispers, and feeling a constant sense of dread. Her final entry was the most chilling.
They're coming for us. I can hear them. Mommy and Daddy don't believe me, but I know they're real. They want us to join them. I'm scared.
As Sarah read the last words, a chill ran down her spine. It was then that they heard a faint giggle, like a child laughing. coming from behind them. They turned around, but there was nothing there. The room felt colder, the darkness closing in around them.
We need to leave, now.
John said, grabbing Sarah's hand. They rushed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind them. That night, the nightmares returned, worse than before. They saw the horrific scenes from the drawings happening in real life. The figure with the knife stood over their bed, a shadowy presence loomed in the hallway, and the house seemed to groan and creak as if it were alive. The next day, they decided to research the history of the house. They went to the local library and dug through old newspapers and records. What they found was horrifying. The previous owners, Mary's family, had disappeared without a trace. The police had found the house empty, with no signs of a struggle. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The more they uncovered, the more they realized they were in danger. The drawings, the diary, the strange occurrences, they were all connected. It was as if the house was trying to tell them something, to warn them. That night, the atmosphere in the house was unbearable. Every creak and whisper felt like a threat. They decided to leave, to find a hotel for the night and figure out what to do in the morning. But as they were packing, they heard a noise from the attic. It was a slow, deliberate thumping, like footsteps.
John, we have to go.
Sarah said, her voice trembling with fear. But John was already halfway up the stairs, determined to confront whatever was up there. Sarah followed, her heart pounding in her chest. They reached the attic and found the hidden room's door wide open. The drawings on the walls seemed to move, the figures shifting and writhing. And in the center of the room stood a shadowy figure, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. Suddenly, Sarah noticed two new drawings on the floor, ones they hadn't seen before. One showed a woman being hung, her face twisted in agony. The other depicted a man engulfed in flames, his body contorted in pain. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. The drawings were predictions, not just of past events, but of their future. Before they could react, the door slammed shut behind them. The room grew darker, the air colder. They tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices filling their heads. Sarah suddenly felt an invisible force around her neck, lifting her off the ground. She struggled, gasping for air, her hands clawing at nothing. Her body twisted and jerked as if she were being hung by an invisible noose.
Sarah!
John screamed, but he was rooted to the spot, unable to move. At the same moment, John felt a searing pain in his chest. He looked down, but there was no knife, no fire, yet the agony was unbearable. He writhed in torment, his skin blistering and burning from an unseen flame. In their final moments, they realized the truth. The house was a trap, a sinister entity that fed on the fear and lives of its inhabitants. The drawings were a warning, a record of the horrors that had befallen those before them. And now, they were the latest victims. Days later, the house stood silent once more, waiting for its next occupants. The hidden room remained untouched, the drawings still on the walls. The story of John and Sarah became another unsolved mystery, a chilling tale for the next owners to uncover.